Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through the leaders of the British Empire in Part 2, beginning with the distinguished military career of Field Marshal Kitchener, master of Imperial warfare, and gently arriving at the heroic yet tragic story of Gordon of Khartoum, the great Imperial adventurer whose courage became legend. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale, share a comment about which military leader inspires you most, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of distant battlefields and exotic lands to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. Horatio, later known as Lord Kitchener, of Khartoum, entered this world as Horatio Herbert Kitchener at Ballet Longford near the town of Lowell in County Kerry in southwestern Ireland on the 24th of June 1850. He would typically go by his middle name, Herbert, throughout his life. His father was Henry Horatio Kitchener, a former colonel in the British Army who had resigned his commission in 1849, a year before Herbert was born. He had used his savings and pension to purchase the Ballet Longford estate in Ireland. This was possible owing to the passage of the Encumbered Estates Act, which had been passed through Parliament in 1849 and related to the selling of lands and estates in Ireland. Such properties were typically encumbered by debt as a result of the Irish potato famine, which was underway at that time. Herbert was born shortly after the family took up residence at Gasport Villa on their new lands. Henry had been born in Suffolk, but the family ultimately traced its ancestry back to France, where their ancestors had been Protestant Huguenots who had fled the country during a period of religious persecution in the late 17th century when Louis XIV was on the French throne. Herbert's mother was Anne Kitchener, a woman 20 years her husband's junior, and she was a woman of a somewhat nervous disposition who would fret over her son during his early years. She and Henry had 4 other children, Henry and Francis, who had been born in England in 1846 and 1848 respectively, and Herbert would have 2 younger brothers arrive while in Ireland, Arthur in 1852 and Walter in 1858. Herbert grew up in Ireland during a tumultuous time in the island's history. The famine there claimed 1 million lives out of a population of 8 million between the mid-1840s and the early 1850s, but it also led hundreds of thousands of people to flee the country in the space of a few years, mostly heading for America. The British government's response to the crisis was appalling, exporting foodstuffs from Ireland while hundreds of thousands died of starvation. In the bleak years of the late 1840s, there were also mass evictions of poor Irish tenant farmers. Henry Kitchener was amongst those who threw many people off his lands in their time of need in the supposed interest of improving the country by acquiring more productive tenants. It was doubtlessly a peculiar environment for Herbert, as the Kitcheners became deeply unpopular in North County Kerry owing to the actions of his father. It was also an unstructured existence. Henry Kitchener was an eccentric who was said to use old newspapers instead of a blanket in his bed and who neglected Herbert's education. When a relative, Francis Elliot Kitchener, a fellow of Trinity College, Dublin, met with Herbert in the early 1860s as he neared his teenage years, he found that he had only a rudimentary grasp of grammar and basic mathematics. Anne Kitchener was ill during much of Herbert's youth. She was suffering from tuberculosis, a disease which, along with cholera, had replaced smallpox and other diseases for which there were vaccines available by that time, as one of the deadly killers of the 19th century. There were limited effective treatments for it, but it was believed that warmer climates with crisper air were better for those who suffered from it. It was for this reason that Henry Kitchener decided to sell his estate in Kerry in 1864, and the family relocated to Switzerland. The move was unsuccessful though, as Anne died shortly after they arrived in Switzerland. In the Alpine country, young Herbert received private tuition for a time, but eventually he was sent to be formally educated at Monterey on the shores of Lake Geneva. There, his lack of educational development saw him mocked by his classmates, and it is widely understood that he was scarred psychologically by the experience. The shock to his self-esteem at a formative age might well have fueled his extreme desire to prove himself in later life. In 1866, his father remarried and decided to move with his new wife to New Zealand, a land of opportunity and adventure at the time in the mid-19th century. Not long afterwards, Herbert, like his brothers, was sent to follow in his father's military footsteps and was packed off to the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich near London in England. He would remain there until 1870. In 1870, Herbert was encouraged to cross the English Channel to France by his father, who was temporarily back in Europe from New Zealand. There, the Franco-Prussian War had broken out in July 1870 between the Second French Empire, ruled by Napoleon III, and Prussia, the largest of the North German states, which under the rule of King Wilhelm the Fame and his leading minister, Otto von Bismarck, had engaged in a series of aggressive wars against Denmark and Austria in the 1860s in order to expand its control of Central Europe. Bismarck had set about trying to provoke the French into a war towards the end of that decade, with the ultimate goal of coercing all of the other German states, including Austria, into a German confederation which would be dominated by Prussia. Napoleon had taken the bait and responded to Prussian efforts to impose Leopold of the Prussian royal house of Hohenzollern as the new king of Spain by declaring war on Prussia. The Franco-Prussian War, which followed between July 1870 and January 1871, was a military disaster for the French, as Napoleon was forced to abdicate after a series of military defeats, and the Prussians laid siege to Paris in September 1870. Herbert was in France to witness the events of the French defeat at the Battle of Le Marmora in January 1871, shortly before the war ended, and Bismarck succeeded in wresting territory from the French in Alsace and Lorraine, and then in uniting the German states into the new German Empire. Throughout these events, Kitchener worked as a stretcher-bearer with the French ambulance service, his first exposure to action. Kitchener returned to England in 1871, where he enlisted in the Royal Engineers. On the 4th of January 1871, he was immediately reprimanded for having been in France during the short-lived war there, the perception being that as a British military cadet, he had been inappropriately involved on the French side of a conflict in which Britain was neutral. He was also ill when he returned, having developed pneumonia towards the end of his sojourn in France after he ascended in a hot air balloon in order to gain a bird's-eye view of the Army of the Lear in action in northern France. Despite these issues, his training continued at Chatham, and after a time there, he was sent to serve with a mounted unit of the Royal Engineers at Aldershot. He did not enjoy his time here, and Kitchener's propensity for preferring to work largely alone and to keep his own counsel was already in evidence. But he would soon be able to leave England altogether as a result of both his growing abilities as an engineer and also his multilingualism. Though Kitchener's formal education started very late, he had developed an aptitude for languages and was able to speak French and German sufficiently by the 1870s, while also later learning Turkish and Arabic. Kitchener's life and career must be viewed in the wider context of the expansion of the British Empire and also the age of European imperialism. Britain had emerged as a colonial power in the early 17th century when it began establishing colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America and in the Caribbean, followed by the acquisition of its first footholds in India in the 1660s. These were just stepping stones towards a much vaster empire in the second half of the 18th century as the English East India Company conquered much of India. By the time Herbert's father was serving in the British military, Britain was expanding its reach across the globe. Australia and New Zealand were being settled. Singapore had been established as a British colony in 1819, and Hong Kong was acquired. In southern China at the end of the First Opium War of 1839 to 1842. Every year seemed to bring new territories in far-flung places, but there was also growing competition as France, in particular, began colonizing countries like Algeria and taking an interest in Indochina. This imperialism would expand exponentially in the second half of the 19th century. Kitchener's life would be shaped by the expansion of the British Empire. Following his training with the Royal Engineers, Kitchener was sent to the Levant, where the Corps was involved in the mid-1870s in carrying out extensive surveys of Palestine. This region was loosely controlled by the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, but the British government and missionary movements had begun sending extensive expeditions to the Holy Land to chart it and its people since the 1830s. An ordnance survey of the city of Jerusalem had been carried out in the mid-1860s to map the entire topography and built environment of the Holy City. Between 1874 and 1877, Kitchener and one of his closest friends from the Royal Engineer Academy back in England, Claude Conde, were employed to map extensive parts of Palestine under the remit of the Palestine Exploration Fund. In 1875, in the course of this work, the pair were attacked by a group of local Arabs with rocks and makeshift clubs. Conde was badly wounded, and Kitchener was bruised. They were both briefly sent back to England to recuperate, but Kitchener soon returned to Palestine alone to finish the survey. This led to a split in their friendship, as Conde had wished for Kitchener to wait for him to heal fully before resuming their work in Palestine. In response to the split between them, Kitchener tried to claim most of the credit for that exceptional work, which the Palestine Exploration Fund published in several volumes in the early 1880s as the Survey of Western Palestine, Memoirs of the Topography, Orography, Hydrography, and Archaeology, a monumental publication in the history of surveying and mapping. It provided details of all hills, rivers, villages, and even large buildings in western Palestine. Conde would later return to Palestine to oversee a similar survey of eastern Palestine, but by that time, Kitchener had been otherwise employed. In 1878, shortly after he finished his work in western Palestine, he was dispatched to Cyprus. The eastern Mediterranean island, which had been under Ottoman control since the early 1570s, had been effectively given to Britain by the Ottoman government in the summer of 1878 in return for clandestine British support for the Ottomans at the Congress of Berlin, which had been called to adjudicate on the peace terms at the end of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 in the Balkans. As soon as British control of the island was established, Kitchener was almost immediately sent there and charged with undertaking a survey of the entire island for the Royal Engineers, of a similar kind to that which he had worked on in Palestine. He would remain in Cyprus for much of the next 5 years. The survey itself took over 3 years to complete, but resulted in ordnance survey maps of the island and the most extensive scientific studies of it ever undertaken. Meanwhile, in 1879, he was promoted to the position of Vice-Consul of Anatolia, making him one of the British government's senior diplomatic liaisons with the Ottoman Empire. In 1883, Kitchener received word that he was going to be redeployed from Cyprus to Egypt. He was heading to what was effectively a new part of the British Empire. Egypt had been ruled by the Ottomans between the 16th and 18th centuries, but the government in Istanbul had been forced to grant the country a growing amount of autonomy in the second half of the 18th century as its empire weakened. Though nominally, Egypt remained an Ottoman province. In the 1850s, the Suez Canal Company, a largely French operation working in conjunction with the Egyptian government, work had begun on building a canal between the Mediterranean and Red Seas, negating the need to sail around Africa to get to Asia. This was of immense significance for the British, as it drastically reduced the amount of time it would take to sail between Britain and the British Raj in India. Accordingly, after the canal was completed and opened in 1869, the British began trying to gain increasing influence here. In 1875, they succeeded in wresting control of the Suez Canal Company from the French by buying out the interest of the Egyptian ruler Ismail to solidify their control over the canal. The British government effectively turned Egypt into a British protectorate in 1882 in response to domestic unrest in the country. Egypt would retain a nominal independence going forward, but it was effectively a British colony thereafter until the middle of the 20th century. Kitchener was amongst some of the first waves of British military officers and administrators sent there. When he arrived in 1883, Kitchener would spend the next 15 years of his life assigned to Egypt, though he would regularly be sent to other parts of Africa on various tasks, notably to Sudan and East Africa. Much of his time was spent in Cairo. His roles were multifaceted. For instance, one of his first duties in the mid-1880s was as part of efforts to modernize the Egyptian military, one of the main provisions of the British presence in Egypt. He was also involved in surveying and mapping. Shortly after he arrived in North Africa, for example, he was dispatched to the Araba Valley, along what is now the border between Israel and Jordan, to survey and study the region here between the Dead Sea and the city of Aqaba. In 1885, he was sent to the East African island of Zanzibar, which had broken from the Sultanate of Oman in southern Arabia after hundreds of years of being ruled by it. The British had subsequently begun to establish a presence here, one which was largely ratified under the terms of a new Congress of Berlin held in 1884 and 1885, at which much of Africa was effectively divided up by the European powers. Kitchener was involved in a boundary commission there in 1885, which involved the now largely powerless Sultan of Zanzibar and the Germans who controlled German East Africa on the mainland. In the mid-1880s, he was also involved in supplying and relieving General Charles Gordon in Sudan from Egypt during the early stages of the Mahdist War between the native Sudanese powers and the British. Throughout all of this, Kitchener continued to earn promotions. When he was sent to Egypt in 1883, it was with the new rank of captain and as a bimbashi, the equivalent of a major in the Ottoman system of military titles. He was promoted to the rank of brevet major in 1884, but his most important promotion came in 1887 when he was appointed as governor of Eastern Sudan, a position he most likely acquired owing to Gordon's death in Khartoum in 1885, and also Kitchener's exceptional linguistic abilities, which allowed him to converse with almost anyone he came into contact with in Egypt and Sudan. By the late 1890s, his ascent as a fully fledged military commander, rather than just a surveyor and administrator, was clear, as he was increasingly in charge of military operations in the seemingly never-ending Mahdist War. In 1892, he gained his most significant promotion yet when he became the Sirdar of the Egyptian army, effectively being placed in charge of it. Yet more honours would eventually follow in the late 1890s. So who was Herbert Kitchener? Beyond the promotions, the maps, and the military career, he was a difficult individual. While no one doubted his abilities within the senior colonial administration, in Egypt during the 1880s and 1890s, they were also aware that Kitchener was not liked by many people and had a problematic personality. Gordon, who Kitchener was charged with relieving in Sudan in the mid-1880s, claimed of him that he was the kind of individual that would wait until you were just about to drown before offering you any help. Nevertheless, he was a formidable character, with a personality that was matched by his physical appearance, standing at 6'2", and with a moustache that was prematurely grey and a head of hair which had been bleached blonde by the warm Saharan sun. He cut an imposing figure in Egypt. By the 1890s, he did also, it appears, soften his approach towards others as the years went by. While he was never popular, he did over time acquire friends and allies in Cairo as he came to be less brusque with people and to have more tact. He needed to, back in 1889, after the Battle of Toski and the Mahdist War. One of those who served under Kitchener remarked that they hated the sight of him. There was also some personality underneath the stern administrator. He was an avid collector of ceramics, oriental furniture, and carpets, and much of his collection has subsequently become part of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. While perhaps more unusual for a male in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly of a military background, Kitchener also enjoyed flower arranging. He was also a member of the Freemasons after joining a lodge shortly after his arrival in Egypt. Overall, he was inscrutable, unknown to most, and emotionally distant, a trait which was exacerbated by a chronic squint he had developed in the mid-1880s, owing to overexposure to the desert sun in Egypt and Sudan, which made it difficult for him to look anyone directly in the eye. Kitchener's sexuality has been a matter of extensive debate over the years. It is probable that he was at least bisexual, and most likely gay. Early on in his life, as a cadet and a trainee at the academy in Woolwich, he developed a close relationship with Claude Conde, his fellow surveyor in Palestine, which many historians have speculated was of a romantic nature. Sexual nature. He never married, though there were suggestions that he might marry Heron Baker shortly after he arrived in Egypt. She was the 16-year-old daughter of Colonel Valentine Baker, whom Kitchener had met in Constantinople during his time as the proconsul of Anatolia. She appears to have developed some affection for Kitchener, despite the fact that at 33, he was twice her age when he arrived in Egypt, where the Bakers had relocated on account of her mother's ill health. He never pressed to marry her, and she died a year or two later from typhoid fever. In the interim, Gina had become known for moving in a social circle of young officers in Cairo who were termed Kitchener's Cubs, and to whom he gave nicknames, like the Brat and Handsome Hammy. Moreover, it was noted of his time in social engagements in England as he aged and became more famous in British society, that he kept women at a distance, particularly when there was any possibility of a marriage being proposed. Yet at the same time, there is no overt indication that Kitchener engaged in many, if any, relationships during his adult years. It appears he was largely chaste throughout his life, and the question of his sexuality remains unresolved. Kitchener had developed a successful career in the 20 or so years between the mid-1870s and the mid-1890s, first as a surveyor in the Levant and Cyprus, and then as a military administrator in Egypt. He might well have remained just that, a moderately important figure in the British imperial setup, but hardly a household name, nor one that would occupy the pages of history books a century after his death, had it not been for the events of the late 1890s. These were intimately connected with British expansion in Africa. During these years, in the 1870s and 1880s, many of the other European powers had become determined to carve out their own overseas empires in emulation of Britain and France. By the 1880s, Belgium, Germany, and Italy were all trying to acquire lands in Africa, and even the antiquated colonial powers of yesteryear, Spain and Portugal, were attempting to expand their remaining footholds on the African coastline. It was in this environment that Cecil Rhodes, the prophet of British expansion in South Africa, began pressing the government to acquire a continuous string of colonies between South Africa and Egypt, the so-called Cape to Cairo project. By the 1890s, it appeared that Belgium and Germany had scuppered this plan by seizing the Congo and German East Africa, thus cutting off the possibility of an unbroken chain of colonies. But the British government was nevertheless determined to secure control over the course of the River Nile in northern Africa, south towards the Great Lakes, a part of the continent which was still largely under native rule. Kitchener was to be absolutely central to the events that ensued. In 1896, Kitchener was appointed to oversee a British military expedition south of Egypt into Sudan in order to defeat the Mahdist state there, which had revolted against British and Egyptian rule in the early 1880s, famously leading to Gordon's death in Khartoum in 1885 and the seizure of that city, while attacks would be launched against sites further north and along the Red Sea coast in the years that followed. Since then, the region had been largely independent. But by 1896, the government of Lord Salisbury in England was determined to reclaim control of the country and prevent French expansion along the River Nile and into the Horn of Africa, as it sought to establish a chain of colonies of its own, running west-east across northern Africa from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. The leadership of the Anglo-Egyptian expedition would be Kitchener's first time leading a full military campaign. He would approach it methodically, preparing carefully in Egypt and planning to move south incrementally over a 2-year campaign to eventually seize Khartoum. Kitchener's expedition began moving southwards in mid-March of 1896. Eventually, his army would consist of approximately 9,000 men, a mix of British soldiers from different parts of the British Empire such as India and Ireland, and Egyptian troops. The initial target was to seize Dongola in northern Sudan, which was achieved in September 1896 after routing a Mahdist army of about 3,000 men at the Battle of Firke during the summer and another clash at the Battle of Hafir in September. The Mahdist Khalifa was concerned at this juncture that Kitchener would immediately move to seize Khartoum or strike his position at Omdurman near the city, but Kitchener was in no rush to do so. Instead, he very methodically established the Anglo-Egyptian expedition in northern Sudan and spent much of 1897 concentrating on extending the railway lines which had been built by the British along the course of the River Nile southwards in order to ensure his supply lines were sound and he could be reinforced if needed. The wisdom of his cautious approach was seen in the spring of 1898 when his forces, by then well in excess of 12,000 men, won a resounding victory against the Mahdist forces at the Battle of Atbara, in which upwards of 5,000 Sudanese were either killed, wounded, or captured for the loss of a few dozen men. The Maxim machine gun, which had been invented in 1884, was employed to devastating effect by Kitchener's forces in a clash which lasted little more than an hour. The Sudan campaign culminated on the 2nd of September 1898 in the Battle of Omdurman, one of the most significant engagements of the European age of imperialism, fought just to the north and on the other side of the Nile from Khartoum. This was largely owing to the size of the army, which would be arrayed against Kitchener and his men when they clashed near the banks of the River Nile that early autumn day. The Khalifa's forces had swelled to perhaps more than 50,000 men, though the exact number is a matter of some conjecture. Kitchener had approximately 25,000 men under his command, but many of these were Egyptian soldiers or even raw Sudanese recruits who had allied with the expeditionary force since 1896. The British and Imperial contingent only made up 8,000 or so men, but yet again, the British were ably aided by the provision of 24 Maxim guns, while 10 steamer ships with mounted guns were supporting them from the River Nile. Nevertheless, the sheer size of the Mahdist force, which consisted of large numbers of fast-moving cavalry, ensured that no easy victory would be achieved. In the end, it was the use of Zaba barricades to block the Mahdist cavalry during the charges, and the extensive use of the Maxim and Nordenfeldt guns from the river, gunboats that broke the mist lines. The battle had begun shortly after dawn, but was won before midday, with over 12,000 Sudanese casualties and thousands more wounded, and many captured during the ensuing rout. The Anglo-Egyptian expedition had lost 47 men, with a few hundred wounded. The British soon entered Khartoum, 13 years after Gordon's defeat and the loss of the city. The Battle of Omdurman was one of the most significant colonial victories ever achieved by the British. Kitchener followed up his victory at Omdurman with another famous episode in the history of European colonial activity in Africa. This was the famous Fashoda incident, which focused on control of the settlement of Fashoda on the White Nile in what is now South Sudan. It had been established in the middle of the 19th century by the Egyptians as an outpost that controlled many of the trade routes across Central Africa and so was of considerable strategic importance. Though the station had been abandoned for many years, following his victory at Omdurman, Kitchener opened a message from Prime Minister Salisbury, which instructed him that he was to proceed to Fashoda and secure the region for Britain in order to prevent the French from establishing themselves there. Kitchener immediately began the march south, but when he arrived at Fashoda in the middle of September, he found a French detachment under Captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand, already firmly in place there since July. A standoff followed over the next several weeks as both sides waited for instructions from London and Paris, and for a time, war between Britain and France over the area was a very real possibility. However, eventually, the French relented on the grounds that the British military presence in Sudan was too extensive to claim Fashoda, and owing to domestic unrest back in France over the Dreyfus affair, Marchand began withdrawing his men. On the 13th of October, it was to both his and Kitchener's credit that over 4 weeks of a tense military standoff, they avoided any bloodshed. With control of Fashoda secured, Kitchener set about bringing the Mahdist War to an end in Sudan, nearly 2 decades after the revolt had started in the early 1880s. The victory at Omdurman and the capture of Khartoum led quickly to the establishment of the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium Agreement in January 1899, through which the facade of Egyptian independence was maintained by allowing the Khedive of Egypt a role in appointing a British Governor-General to administer Sudan. This paid some lip service to historic Egyptian claims to Sudan, which stretched back to pharaonic times, but the reality was that Sudan was now a British colony. Even before the Condominium Agreement was reached, Kitchener had been appointed as Governor of Sudan. Over the next several months, the last bits of native resistance were defeated as religious leaders in the country tried vainly to continue the struggle. In order to assuage such resistance, Kitchener quickly implemented measures to respect Muslim traditions and religious practices in Khartoum and beyond. Meanwhile, Kitchener was rewarded handsomely by the British government and, lauded by the public back in his home country, on the 31st of October 1898, just over 2 weeks after the Fashoda incident, he was awarded the title of Baron Kitchener of Khartoum and of Aspel in his father's native Suffolk. To the British public, who lauded him in the aftermath of the conquest of Sudan, he became colloquially known as Lord Kitchener. Kitchener was not destined to remain in Khartoum for long. His reputation was such that when the Second Boer War broke out in southern Africa in the autumn of 1899, he was soon dispatched there as well as one of Britain's senior commanders. Though the events there constitute perhaps the blackest mark Against his character, the war itself was a legacy of European colonization of the region. Until the early 19th century, the Cape Colony at the southern tip of Africa, around what is today Cape Town, had been established as a Dutch colony populated by a group of Dutch colonists and French and German Protestants, who eventually became known over time as the Boers, a word derived from the Old Dutch Germanic term for a farmer. Britain took over the Cape Colony during the Napoleonic Wars, a dispensation which the Boers were unhappy with and which led many to move further to the north and northeast into Natal, the Transvaal, and along the course of the Orange River, where they hoped to run their own affairs. However, with the discovery of extensive gold and diamond mines in southern Africa in the 1870s and 1880s, British South Africa continued to expand, eventually leading to clashes with the Boers. A new war broke out in 1899 after the failure of peace negotiations between the two powers. Kitchener was initially the second in command in the prosecution of the Boer War, junior to Field Marshal Lord Roberts, who had been placed in command of the British forces in South Africa. Kitchener served as his chief of staff, notably during the Battle of Paardeberg, a major clash between the British and Boers in February 1900, which did much to blunt the possibility of a Boer victory when thousands of their soldiers were captured by the British. Further battles occurred over the course of 1900. Roberts was eventually recalled to London in late 1900, and Kitchener was placed in command of British forces in South Africa in November. He would remain there for a year and a half until the end of the war in May 1902. The war had turned into a brutal guerrilla campaign after the early British victories in 1900. The Boers had reverted to hit-and-run tactics, attacking British positions and then disappearing into the vast open countryside of the region. This prompted Kitchener to devise a controversial strategy to deal with the situation. He initiated a scorched earth policy in which Boer farms and livelihoods were systematically destroyed to deny the guerrillas supplies and shelter. The Boer civilian population was rounded up and placed in concentration camps. Some historians estimate that as many as 27,000 Boer women and children died in these camps, largely from disease and malnutrition, out of a total Boer population of perhaps 120,000. A further 20,000 black Africans also died in separate camps. While the strategy was effective in eventually bringing the war to an end, it left a permanent stain on Kitchener's reputation and contributed to long-standing Boer resentment against British rule in South Africa. Even at the time, there was considerable opposition to the policy in Britain, with liberal politicians and activists highlighting the conditions in the camps. Kitchener defended the policy as a military necessity, but the humanitarian cost was enormous. The Boer War finally ended on the 31st of May 1902 with the signing of the Peace of Vereeniging. Under the terms of the treaty, the Boer republics were incorporated into the British Empire, but the Boers were promised eventual self-government. Kitchener had achieved victory, but at a terrible cost in human suffering. Following the end of the Boer War, Kitchener returned to Britain as a national hero, despite the controversy over the concentration camps. He was elevated to the peerage as Viscount Kitchener of Khartoum and of the Vaal in the Transvaal colony and the Orange River colony. In 1902, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in India, one of the most prestigious military posts in the empire. He would remain in India for 7 years, from 1902 to 1909, during which time he undertook major reforms of the Indian Army. His main achievement was the reorganization of the military structure in India, reducing costs while improving efficiency. He also oversaw the construction of new barracks and training facilities and modernized the army's equipment and tactics. However, his time in India was also marked by conflicts with the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, over the control of military policy. Kitchener believed that as Commander-in-Chief, he should have complete authority over military matters, while Curzon insisted that the civilian government should maintain oversight. The dispute became so intense that both men threatened to resign. Eventually, the British government sided with Kitchener, and Curzon resigned in 1905. This victory established Kitchener's reputation as someone who would not compromise on matters of military authority. In 1909, Kitchener left India and spent the next few years in relative retirement, though he remained active in military circles. He travelled extensively, visiting Egypt, Australia, and New Zealand. In 1911, he was appointed as British agent and consul general in Egypt, effectively making him the ruler of the country under the nominal authority of the Khedive. He undertook significant infrastructure projects, including improvements to irrigation systems and the construction of the Aswan Low Dam. His time in Egypt was generally successful, and he was respected by both the British community and many Egyptians for his administrative efficiency. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, Kitchener was in Britain on leave. His appointment as Secretary of State for War on the 5th of August came as something of a surprise, as it was unusual for a serving military officer to take on a civilian cabinet position. However, Prime Minister H. Asquith believed that Kitchener's reputation and military experience would be invaluable in organizing Britain's war effort. Kitchener's first major contribution to the war effort was his recognition that the conflict would not be over quickly, as many had predicted. While others talked of the war being over by Christmas 1914, Kitchener predicted that it would last at least 3 years and require massive armies. He immediately set about organizing a massive recruitment campaign to expand the British Army. From its peacetime strength of around 250,000 men to over 1 million, his prediction proved remarkably accurate. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, Kitchener was in Britain on leave. His appointment as Secretary of State for War on the 5th of August came as something of a surprise, as it was unusual for a serving military officer to take on a civilian cabinet position. However, Prime Minister H. Asquith believed that Kitchener's reputation and military experience would be invaluable in organizing Britain's war effort. Kitchener's first major contribution to the war effort was his recognition that the conflict would not be over quickly, as many had predicted. While others talked of the war being over by Christmas 1914, Kitchener predicted that it would last at least 3 years and require massive armies. He immediately set about organizing a massive recruitment campaign to expand the British Army, from its peacetime strength of around 250,000 men to over 1 million. His prediction proved remarkably accurate. The war would indeed last over 4 years and require the mobilization of millions of men. Kitchener's recruitment campaigns became legendary, particularly the famous poster featuring his pointing finger and the words, "Your country needs you." This image became one of the most iconic recruitment posters in history and helped to attract hundreds of thousands of volunteers to the army. By the end of 1914, over 1 million men had enlisted. However, Kitchener's approach to the war was not without criticism. His autocratic style and reluctance to share information with his cabinet colleagues caused friction. He was also criticized for his handling of munitions production, which initially struggled to meet the demands of modern warfare. The shortage of artillery shells became a major political issue in 1915. Despite these challenges, Kitchener remained hugely popular with the British public, who saw him as the embodiment of British military prowess. His reputation had been built over decades of successful colonial campaigns, and many believed that his experience would be crucial in winning the war. However, the nature of the First World War was very different from the colonial conflicts in which Kitchener had made his reputation. The Western Front became a brutal stalemate of trench warfare, very different from the mobile campaigns he had fought in Sudan and South Africa. Kitchener struggled to adapt to this new form of warfare, and his strategic thinking was often criticized by other military leaders. One of the most controversial episodes of Kitchener's tenure as Secretary of State for War was the Gallipoli campaign of 1915. Kitchener supported the plan to force the Dardanelles and capture Constantinople, believing it would knock Turkey out of the war and open a new front against Germany. However, the campaign was poorly planned and executed, resulting in heavy casualties and ultimate failure. The disaster at Gallipoli damaged Kitchener's reputation and led to questions about his strategic judgment. As the war progressed, Kitchener found himself increasingly marginalized by other political and military leaders. Prime Minister Asquith and other cabinet members grew frustrated with his secretive approach and reluctance to delegate authority. Military leaders like General Sir William Robertson began to take over more of the strategic planning. By 1916, there were discussions about removing Kitchener from his position. However, his popular appeal remained strong, and Asquith was reluctant to dismiss such a national hero. Instead, it was decided to send Kitchener on a mission to Russia to discuss military cooperation with the Tsarist government. This mission would prove to be his last. On the 5th of June 1916, Kitchener boarded HMS Hampshire at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, bound for Russia. The ship was escorted by destroyers for part of the journey, but rough weather forced the escorts to turn back. HMS Hampshire was traveling alone when it struck a German naval mine off the coast of the Orkneys. The ship sank rapidly, and of the 749 people on board, only 12 survived. Kitchener's body was never recovered from the sea. The loss of Kitchener was a shock to the British public and the government. Despite the criticisms of his performance as Secretary of State for War, he remained a popular figure, and his death was seen as a major blow to the war effort. Conspiracy theories soon emerged about the circumstances of his death, with some suggesting that he had been deliberately targeted by German agents, or even that he had been murdered by his own government. However, there is no credible evidence to support these theories, and the official conclusion that the ship hit a mine remains the most likely explanation. Kitchener's legacy is complex and controversial. On one hand, he was undoubtedly one of the most successful British military commanders of the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. His conquest of Sudan and his organizational abilities during the early years of the First World War were remarkable achievements. The expansion of the British Army under his leadership was crucial to Britain's eventual victory in the war. On the other hand, his methods were often brutal, and his treatment of civilian populations, particularly during the Boer War, was harsh by any standards. The concentration camps he established in South Africa resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of women and children, and this remains a dark stain on his reputation. His autocratic style and reluctance to work with others also limited his effectiveness as a political leader during the First World War. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that Kitchener was a figure of immense importance in British imperial history. He embodied the confidence and ambition of the British Empire at its height, and his military campaigns helped to establish British control over vast areas of Africa. His influence on military organization and his recognition of the scale of the challenge posed by the First World War were significant contributions to British success. Kitchener died at the age of 65, at the height of his fame, but also at a time when his methods and approach were being increasingly questioned. His death marked the end of an era in British military history, as the old style of imperial warfare gave way to the mechanized brutality of modern conflict. In the years following his death, Kitchener was remembered as both a great imperial hero and a controversial figure whose methods reflected the attitudes and prejudices of his time. What do you think of Lord Kitchener? Was he a brilliant military organizer whose methods were necessary for the expansion and defense of the British Empire? Or was he a ruthless commander whose treatment of civilian populations was inexcusable even by the standards of his time? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, Kitchener was in Britain on leave. His appointment as Secretary of State for War on the 5th of August came as something of a surprise, as it was unusual for a serving military officer to take on a civilian cabinet position. However, Prime Minister H. Asquith believed that Kitchener's reputation and military experience would be invaluable in organizing Britain's war effort. Kitchener's first major contribution to the war effort was his recognition that the conflict would not be over quickly, as many had predicted. While others talked of the war being over by Christmas 1914, Kitchener predicted that it would last at least 3 years and require massive armies. He immediately set about organizing a massive recruitment campaign to expand the British Army, from its peacetime strength of around 250,000 men to over 1 million. His prediction proved remarkably accurate. The war would indeed last over 4 years and require the mobilization of millions of men. Kitchener's recruitment campaigns became legendary, particularly the famous poster featuring his pointing finger and the words, "Your country needs you." This image became one of the most iconic recruitment posters in history and helped to attract hundreds of thousands of volunteers to the army. By the end of 1914, over 1 million men had enlisted. However, Kitchener's approach to the war was not without criticism. His autocratic style and reluctance to share information with his cabinet colleagues caused friction. He was also criticized for his handling of munitions production, which initially struggled to meet the demands of modern warfare. The shortage of artillery shells became a major political issue in 1915. Despite these challenges, Kitchener remained hugely popular with the British public, who saw him as the embodiment of British military prowess. His reputation had been built over decades of successful colonial campaigns, and many believed that his experience would be crucial in winning the war. However, the nature of the First World War was very different from the colonial conflicts in which Kitchener had made his reputation. The Western Front became a brutal stalemate of trench warfare, very different from the mobile campaigns he had fought in Sudan and South Africa. Kitchener struggled to adapt to this new form of warfare, and his strategic thinking was often criticized by other military leaders. One of the most controversial episodes of Kitchener's tenure as Secretary of State for War was the Gallipoli Campaign of 1915. Kitchener supported the plan to force the Dardanelles and capture Constantinople, believing it would knock Turkey out of the war and open a new front against Germany. However, the campaign was poorly planned and executed, resulting in heavy casualties and ultimate failure. The disaster at Gallipoli damaged Kitchener's reputation and led to questions about his strategic judgment. As the war progressed, Kitchener found himself increasingly marginalized by other political and military leaders. Prime Minister Asquith and other cabinet members grew frustrated with his secretive approach and reluctance to delegate authority. Military leaders like General Sir William Robertson began to take over more of the strategic planning. By 1916, there were discussions about removing Kitchener from his position. However, his popular appeal remained strong, and Asquith was reluctant to dismiss such a national hero. Instead, it was decided to send Kitchener on a mission to Russia to discuss military cooperation with the Tsarist government. This mission would prove to be his last. On the 5th of June 1916, Kitchener boarded HMS Hampshire at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, bound for Russia. The ship was escorted by destroyers for part of the journey, but rough weather forced the escorts to turn back. HMS Hampshire was traveling alone when it struck a German naval mine off the coast of the Orkneys. The ship sank rapidly, and of the 749 people on board, only 12 survived. Kitchener's body was never recovered from the sea. The loss of Kitchener was a shock to the British public and the government. Despite the criticisms of his performance as Secretary of State for War, he remained a popular figure, and his death was seen as a major blow to the war effort. Conspiracy theories soon emerged about the circumstances of his death, with some suggesting that he had been deliberately targeted by German agents, or even that he had been murdered by his own government. However, there is no credible evidence to support these theories, and the official conclusion that the ship hit a mine remains the most likely explanation. Kitchener's legacy is complex and controversial. On one hand, he was undoubtedly one of the most successful British military commanders of the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. His conquest of Sudan and his organizational abilities during the early years of the First World War were remarkable achievements. The expansion of the British Army under his leadership was crucial to Britain's eventual victory in the war. On the other hand, his methods were often brutal, and his treatment of civilian populations, particularly during the Boer War, was harsh by any standards. The concentration camps he established in South Africa resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of women and children, and this remains a dark stain on his reputation. His autocratic style and reluctance to work with others also limited his effectiveness as a political leader during the First World War. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that Kitchener was a figure of immense importance in British imperial history. He embodied the confidence and ambition of the British Empire at its height, and his military campaigns helped to establish British control over vast areas of Africa. His influence on military organization and his recognition of the scale of the challenge posed by the First World War were significant contributions to British success. Kitchener died at the age of 65, at the height of his fame, but also at a time when his methods and approach were being increasingly questioned. His death marked the end of an era in British military history, as the old style of imperial warfare gave way to the mechanized brutality of modern conflict. In the years following his death, Kitchener was remembered as both a great imperial hero and a controversial figure whose methods reflected the attitudes and prejudices of his time. What do you think of Lord Kitchener? Was he a brilliant military organizer whose methods were necessary for the expansion and defense of the British Empire? Or was he a ruthless commander whose treatment of civilian populations was inexcusable, even by the standards of his time. Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Charles, later known as Gordon of Khartoum, came into this world as Charles George Gordon on the 28th of January 1833 in Woolwich, a district in southeast London, best known as the home of the Royal Military Academy, where officers of the Royal Artillery and the Royal Engineers were trained for the British Army. His father was Henry William Gordon, an artilleryman and veteran of the Napoleonic Wars who rose to the rank of Major General. He came from a family in which 4 generations had served in the British Army. His mother was Elizabeth Enderby, who was from a family of whaling merchants that started off mainly trading in New England. But after the American War of Independence, the Enderbys sponsored expeditions to Australia and New Zealand. The 31-year-old Henry Gordon married Elizabeth in May 1817. She was 6 years his junior. Following her marriage to Henry William Gordon, Elizabeth would have 11 children over a 20-year period from 1818 to 1838, of whom Charles was the 9th. Charles Gordon grew up during a time when the British Empire had established itself as the world's superpower. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, which ended more than 2 decades of conflict between Britain and France in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, Britain and its mighty Royal Navy managed to gain control of the international trade system for the best part of a century. The empire reached its heights under Queen Victoria, who came to the throne in 1837 following the death of her childless uncle William IV. Although primarily motivated by a desire to increase the wealth of the empire through trade and commerce, the British were also known to use their military power to defend the interests of fellow Christian nations or to help preserve the European balance of power. In 1827, the Royal Navy joined the French and Russian fleets in defeating the Ottoman Turkish fleet at the Bay of Navarino, paving the way for Greek independence in 1829, though the increasing influence of Russia in the Balkans at the expense of the Ottomans was to be a cause for concern in the coming decades. Further to the east, Britain went to war in 1839 with the Qing Empire in China over the right to sell the addictive opium drug, which the Chinese government had tried to ban. Gordon would see action in both Russia and China over the course of his military career. British military officers and their families were posted all around the world in the service of the empire, and in 1836, the 3-year-old Charlie Gordon accompanied his father to a posting in Dublin. 2 years later, Henry William was promoted to lieutenant colonel and transferred to Leith Fort on the Forth Estuary near Edinburgh. In 1840, Colonel Gordon was moved to the island of Corfu in the Ionian Islands, which had become a British protectorate since the Battle of Navarino and would remain under British control until 1864. The Mediterranean climate was a pleasant change from the gloomy weather of the British Isles, and Charles and his siblings enjoyed exploring the island, thereby learning more of the island's ancient origins as the Greek colony of Corcyra and its more recent existence as an outpost of the Venetian maritime empire until its conquest by Napoleon in 1799. The Gordon children also received lessons from an English tutor, alongside readings from the Bible and other religious texts from their mother for 2 or 3 hours a day. Charles Gordon's Mediterranean stay ended after 3 years, when, in 1843, at the age of 10, his parents decided to send him to school in England. Acting upon the advice of the children's governess, Miss Rogers, Henry and Elizabeth sent their son to a small school called Fullan's House in Taunton in Somerset, run by the governess's father and brother, George Rogers, and the Reverend Herbert Rogers. Charles did not enjoy his studies at Fullan's very much, and was a mediocre student, though he developed a talent for drawing and making detailed street maps. In November 1843, a month after Charles started at Fullan's, his beloved sister Emily died of tuberculosis at the age of 17. Emily had been his favorite sibling, and Charlie later recalled that his life was never the same following her untimely death. In October 1845, Colonel Gordon returned to Woolwich to take up a post at the Royal Artillery Barracks. The following year, Charles returned home and attended a nearby school to prepare him for the examinations to the Royal Military Academy. After his return to Woolwich, he became closer to his sister Augusta, who, despite being 11 years older than him, would remain a close confidant throughout his life. Although the 14-year-old Charlie was initially indifferent to his devout sister's persistent efforts to strengthen his religious belief, He would later develop a strong Christian faith. On the 8th of July 1847, Charles George Gordon was appointed a gentleman cadet at the Royal Military Academy. The curriculum consisted of mathematics, fortification, history, geography, French, and German. Although he received good grades in French and fortification, Gordon developed a reputation for challenging authority. The Royal Military Academy had recently established a system of prefects, whereby older boys, given the rank of corporal within the academy, would instill discipline among the younger cadets. During his first year, after being ordered to walk rather than run out of the dining hall after meals, Gordon headbutted one of the senior cadets, knocking him down the stairs and through a glass door. He was placed in confinement and subjected to regular floggings from the school authorities and was fortunate to avoid expulsion. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, Gordon protected himself by seeking isolation from his friends and classmates. But after a while, his rebellious streak returned, and he was often heard making disparaging remarks about the officers during parades. By the time Gordon became a senior cadet, he had become a strict disciplinarian himself. He was due to graduate in 1851, but during an inquiry by the Board of Ordnance into bullying at the academy, Gordon was accused of beating a boy several times with a clothes brush and bruising his back. Though the inquiry recommended his dismissal, the academy authorities satisfied themselves by delaying his graduation by 2 terms, or 6 months. As an expert in drawing, map-making, surveying, and designing fortifications, Gordon hoped to become a military engineer, or sapper. After passing his delayed practical examination in June 1852, the 19-year-old Gordon was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Royal Engineers. He reported to the Royal Engineers Brompton Barracks near the Chatham Dockyard, and over the next 19 months was involved in the renovation and rebuilding of army buildings in the area. Despite his sister Augusta's attempts to find him a suitable Christian bride, Gordon was a shy and lonely young man who always avoided social events. In February 1854, Gordon was promoted to first lieutenant and posted to the garrison at Milford Haven near Pembroke in South Wales. Although Gordon did not see much point to the refortification programme in South Wales, he enjoyed visiting the Pembrokeshire countryside and became friends with Captain Francis Drew, an infantryman of the 11th Regiment. Along with his wife Anne, Drew inspired within Gordon a strong belief in Christianity. Gordon began praying and reading scripture regularly, writing to a delighted Augusta about how this religious transformation had made him happier in life. He was particularly influenced by St. Paul's teaching that, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain," which made him unafraid of death. Following the Drews' example, Gordon did not become a member of any church, but attended congregations of various Christian denominations, including Roman Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, in addition to the Church of England. For almost 40 years since the Battle of Waterloo, the British Army had seen little action. This situation was set to change when in July 1853, Russian armies invaded the Ottoman Empire and occupied the provinces of Wallachia and Moldavia under the pretext of protecting Orthodox Christians in the empire. In November 1853, the Russian Black Sea Fleet defeated and destroyed the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Sinope. Britain and France were afraid that the Russians might march all the way to Constantinople, also known as Istanbul, and intervened on behalf of the Ottomans by declaring war on Russia in March 1854, after trapping the Russian fleet at its base. In the port of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, the British and French landed an army on Crimea in September and began to lay siege to Sevastopol. On the 25th of October, the British managed to repulse a Russian attack on its supply base at Balaclava, during which a failure of communication caused the Light Brigade of more than 600 men to charge into the so-called Valley of Death in the face of Russian cannon. Although the Light Brigade did manage to capture the Russian guns, the heavy casualties sustained damaged the reputation of its commander Lord Cardigan and the commander-in-chief Lord Raglan. Gordon had hoped to see service in the Crimea, but at the end of November, he was ordered to report to his childhood home of Corfu instead. After begging family friends at the War Office for a posting in the Crimea, on the 3rd of December, he was given new orders to join a Royal Engineer unit, mapping minefields in the Crimea, and arrived at Balaclava on the 2nd of January 1855. Lieutenant Gordon was soon at work on the siege lines around Sevastopol. Gordon's brothers Enderby and Henry were also serving in the Crimea, as was his fellow sapper Gerald Graham, a friend from the Royal Military Academy. Gordon would also become close friends with a young infantry officer named Garnet Wolseley, who would cross paths with Gordon frequently and end his distinguished military career as a Field Marshal. In addition to building trenches and carrying out mining operations, Gordon spent much of his time sketching the Russian fortifications in anticipation of a major Allied offensive against Sevastopol. In order to present an accurate picture of the Russian defenses, Gordon often found himself exposed to enemy fire, and in late March he was struck by a spent ball fired from a Russian picket. On the 18th of June, the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, the British and French infantry launched the offensive, seeking to capture the Great Redan and Malakoff fortresses, protecting the southern approaches to Sevastopol. Though Gordon expected the port city to fall within 10 days, the Russians mounted a successful defense, inflicting more than 1,400 British and 6,000 French casualties. The failed offensive is said to have contributed to the death of Lord Raglan. On the 28th of June, seeking to take advantage of the Allied setback, on the 16th of August, a Russian army of almost 60,000 men sought to attack the Allied bases to force them to abandon the siege. They were met at the Chernaya River by almost 30,000 Frenchmen, along with 10,000 Italians from the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, which had joined the Allies in an attempt to obtain British and French diplomatic support for the cause of Italian unification. The Russian defeat encouraged the Allies to make a further assault on the fortifications outside Sevastopol in early September. In the aftermath of the first offensive against the Redan, Gordon remained in the trenches for 34 consecutive days, helping to maintain the condition of the British trenches and continuing to gather intelligence and make sketches of the Russian defences. On the 5th of September, Gordon witnessed the Allied bombardment of the two Russian redoubts, and on the 8th, Malakoff fell to the French. Gordon accompanied the less successful British attack on the Great Redan, but after the French success at Malakoff, the Russians chose to evacuate the southern part of the city, blowing up their powder magazines in the process. On the 9th of September, the Allies captured the city after a year-long siege, effectively bringing an end to the war. In the meantime, Gordon joined a 9,000-man army which supported a naval action that destroyed the Russian fortress of Kinburn at the mouth of the Dnieper River on the 17th of October. After returning to Sevastopol, Gordon spent the next 4 months with his friend Gerald Graham mining and destroying what remained of the city's military installations. During this time, Gordon befriended Romolo Gessi, a military interpreter attached to the Piedmontese army. In March 1856, the Crimean War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. For his service during the war, Gordon was awarded the French Légion d'honneur, the coveted Order of Merit established by Napoleon in 1802. As part of its terms, the Treaty of Paris established the Kingdom of Romania, an autonomous political entity within the Ottoman Empire. The treaty established an international commission to survey the new border between Russia and Romania. In recognition of his drawing and map-making skills, Gordon was appointed to the 3-man British delegation, headed by Colonel Edward Stanton. In May, Gordon went to Romania with his friend Gessi, who planned to visit his widowed mother in Bucharest. Though Gordon could speak French to the Romanian elite, the polyglot Gessi served as an invaluable interpreter among the peasantry. From his base at the port of Galassi on the Black Sea, Gordon spent almost a year mapping out the new frontier. In Bessarabia, the region divided between modern-day Moldova and southwestern Ukraine. After the survey was completed in the spring of 1857, Gordon reported to the British Embassy in Constantinople, where he was assigned to a commission to demarcate the border between Russian Armenia and Ottoman Armenia. Accompanied by a half-Turkish, half-Kurdish officer in Ottoman service who insisted on being called Robert, Gordon charted the mountainous terrain and enjoyed a toboggan ride down the slope of Mount Ararat, the place where Noah's Ark is supposed to have landed at the end of the Great Flood. In addition to his detailed drawings, Gordon also used a camera to document the people and the terrain in Armenia, and he was elected to the Royal Society of Geography the following February for his work as a surveyor and photographer. After returning to England in late summer, he spent the winter with his parents, who had moved to Southampton in their retirement. In the spring of 1858, he returned to Armenia, where he and Robert were joined by a Russian officer, Colonel Kleb. While taking measures to keep the Ottoman and Russian officers as far apart from each other as possible, Gordon noticed that many of the stone cairns he used to demarcate the border had been removed by local farmers during his absence. By the time the work was complete again in November, several cairns had already disappeared, prompting Gordon to return to Constantinople, begging not to be assigned such a task ever again. After returning to Southampton at the end of 1858, in April 1859, Gordon was promoted to captain and appointed second adjutant at the Chatham Depot, serving under its commandant Edward Stanton, whom he had worked with in Romania. Gordon served in this post for around a year, but became bored and petitioned the War Office to be assigned to active service in China, a request that was granted in July 1860. After the end of the First Opium War in 1842, the Chinese authorities ceded the island of Hong Kong to the British and agreed to open 5 so-called treaty ports to Western trade, though the opium trade technically remained illegal. In the 1850s, a further attempt by Chinese officials to suppress the opium trade led to the outbreak of the Second Opium War in October 1856, after an Anglo-French army captured the port of Canton, or Guangzhou, on the 1st of January 1858. The Chinese signed a peace treaty in Tianjin in June, opening up a further 10 treaty ports to Western trade, legalizing the opium trade, and allowing Western merchants and missionaries to travel to the Chinese interior. When hardline ministers in the Chinese court deplored the concessions and encouraged the Xianfeng emperor to continue fighting, a second round of hostilities began in 1859, when the Europeans attacked the Taku forts near Tianjin. By the time Gordon arrived at Tianjin in September 1860, the Anglo-French army had captured the Taku forts and was advancing on the Chinese capital of Beijing. In early October, French and British forces arrived in Beijing and began looting the Summer Palace and the Old Summer Palace. After learning that several British and French officers captured by the Chinese had been brutally executed, the British Commander Lord Elgin ordered the burning of the Old Summer Palace, and as a sapper, Gordon was personally involved in carrying out the operation, although Gordon agreed with his superior that the Chinese deserved to be punished for their treatment. Of the prisoners, he lamented his part in the destruction of the palace. The emperor fled the capital and let his brother Prince Gong sign a convention with the British and French, accepting the concessions made in the Treaty of Tianjin, thus ending the Second Opium War. After peace was made, Gordon and his sappers built living quarters for the occupation army that stayed in Tianjin for the next 18 months to enforce the terms of the treaty. The Qing Empire may have ended the war with the Europeans, but a longer and bloodier war was still ongoing. In the late 1840s, a man from the southern Chinese province of Guangxi named Hong Xiuquan, frustrated by his repeated failures to pass the Imperial civil service examination, was inspired by Christian missionaries and founded a religious movement, after identifying himself as the brother of Jesus Christ. Hong's teachings brought him and his followers into conflict with the Qing authorities, and in January 1851, Hong proclaimed the creation of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom with himself as Heavenly King, with more than 500,000 peasant soldiers. In their ranks, in March 1853, the Taiping rebels captured the former capital of Nanjing on the Yangtze River, which Hong made his new capital. Aiming to capture the capital of Beijing and topple the Qing emperor, the Taiping launched offensives to the north and the west in May. By October, the rebel armies had reached Tianjin, only 100 miles from the capital, but a successful counterattack by the Imperial army stalled the onslaught. With Nanjing besieged by Qing armies, the Taiping leadership began fighting among themselves, and Hong purged several of his senior lieutenants over the next few years. Nevertheless, in May 1860, the Taiping armies managed to break the siege of Nanjing and invaded Jiangsu and Zhejiang provinces, capturing the ancient capital of Hangzhou and the city of Suzhou by June. By the summer of 1860, the Taiping rebels were threatening the treaty port of Shanghai, a city of 300,000, which was home to a large community of Western merchants. Back in England, Gordon had been sympathetic to the Taiping cause due to its Christian influences, but when he stopped briefly in Shanghai en route to Tianjin, he witnessed the atrocities committed by the Taiping against the local peasantry and quickly changed his mind. The American sailor, Frederick Townsend Ward, organized a small band of 200 Western mercenaries armed with modern weapons to assist the Qing soldiers defending Shanghai. Over time, Ward recruited local soldiers to his small army, which remained under the command of Western officers. After winning several skirmishes against the Taiping in March 1862, the Qing government bestowed the honorific title of the ever-victorious army on Ward's small force. The same month, Gordon was sent to Shanghai as part of a 1,000-man force, led by his brother-in-law, General Charles Stavely, which would bolster the ranks of the ever-victorious army. Gordon arrived in Shanghai in May as the head of Stavely's engineers and began to examine the weaknesses of the Taiping defenses, leading attacks to capture several fortified towns in the vicinity of the city. In September, Ward was killed at the Battle of Sixty and replaced by fellow American Henry Burgevine. The new American commander alienated the Chinese, and in January 1863, Li Hongzhang, the imperial governor of Jiangsu province, proposed that Gordon should take command of the ever-victorious army. After receiving permission from the British government to serve under foreign command, on the 25th of March, the 30-year-old Major Charles Gordon took command of the ever-victorious army, whose ranks had swelled to almost 4,000 men. The ever-victorious army's immediate objective was to recapture Suzhou from the rebels. Within days of taking command, he sought to improve the discipline of the men by providing them with uniforms and conducting regular drills. Though Gordon's strict methods led to desertions from the ranks, he also added to his contingent by recruiting hundreds of dissatisfied Taiping soldiers. Gordon was critical of Chinese tactics to launch frontal attacks against the enemy, and with his detailed understanding of the topography, he sought to utilize the canal network in southern Jiangsu to support attacks at key strategic points in the enemy flank and rear. Assisted by a fleet of steamers and Chinese junks, in April, the ever-victorious army successfully recaptured the towns of Changsu and Taikang from the rebels. During both battles, Gordon exhibited considerable bravery under fire, and his inspirational leadership in the Taiping War would earn him the nickname Chinese Gordon in the British press. Gordon's instructions forbidding his men from looting led to mutiny on the 4th of May, which was firmly suppressed. Li Hongzhang was impressed by Gordon's integrity, considering him superior in manner and bearing to any of the foreigners whom I have come into contact with. At the end of May, Gordon attacked the town of Kunshan, which protected the eastern approaches to Suzhou. Gordon led the attack along the canal to Suzhou aboard the ironclad steamer Hyson, sending a force of 350 men to subdue the city, while he sailed up and down the canal blasting the Taiping defenses. The capture of Kunshan opened the way to Suzhou, and the ever-victorious army began attacking the towns surrounding the city. In the meantime, the disgruntled Henry Burgevine had defected from the ever-victorious army and joined the Taiping defense of Suzhou. After Gordon surrounded Burgevine, the American tried to rejoin the Imperial forces, but another attempt to defect prompted Gordon to arrest him and send him away. With Burgevine out of the way in November, Gordon negotiated a surrender with the Taiping princes inside the city after promising to spare their lives. Once the Imperial forces entered the city, Li Hongzhang went back on the agreement and ordered the execution of the Taiping leaders. Li's decision outraged Gordon, who believed that it would only encourage the Taiping to continue their resistance and spill more blood. The enraged Englishman refused to cooperate with Li, and when a messenger arrived bearing gifts from the Tongji Emperor on the 1st of January 1864, Gordon refused to accept them. The refusal was considered a grave insult to the Chinese, and Gordon offered his resignation, but by February he repaired relations with Li Hongzhang and recognized that the Chinese general had implicit orders from the emperor to execute the rebel leaders. With General Zheng Guofan's Hunan army advancing against Nanjing along the Yangtze from the west, Li advanced on the Taiping capital from the east. As the honor of taking Nanjing would be reserved for the imperial troops, Gordon's men carried out the secondary objectives of subduing Taiping resistance at Yixing, Liang, and Jintan, where on the 21st of March, Gordon was wounded lightly in the thigh. After helping Li capture the major city of Changzhou in May, which restored imperial control over the whole of Jiangsu, in June, Gordon disbanded the ever-victorious army. Shortly after the death of Hong Xiuquan in June, Zheng's Hunan army captured Nanjing in July and executed the Heavenly King's teenage son and successor, putting an end to the rebellion. By the time of Nanjing's fall, Gordon was in Beijing to advise the emperor on the reorganization of the imperial armies. He made up for his previous refusal of the emperor's gifts by accepting the noble rank of Viscount, the title of Commander-in-Chief of Jiangsu Province, and the yellow jacket of the emperor's ceremonial bodyguard, which had never been granted to a foreigner before. Once again, he declined a gift of 10,000 silver taels, and likewise declined a substantial sum of money offered to him by Shanghai's grateful merchant community. Having already been promoted to lieutenant colonel in China, Gordon became a companion of the Order of the Bath in December 1864, while he was returning to England. The 32-year-old Gordon was uncomfortable with the fame he had gained in China and resented the journalists who gathered at his parents' house in Southampton upon his arrival. He was happier to see his old friend Romolo Gessi, who sought to recruit Gordon to General Giuseppe Garibaldi's campaign of Italian unification. But Gordon chose to remain at home with his sick father, who died in September 1865. That same month, he accepted a new post at Gravesend in Kent, where he would command the Royal Engineers in the construction of fortifications defending the Thames estuary. Although he considered the fortifications expensive and obsolete, Gordon nevertheless busied himself each morning supervising the construction works. During the afternoons, Gordon dedicated his free time to charitable activities, which he considered part of his Christian duty. Although he had witnessed poverty and destitution in war zones before, he was surprised by the level of deprivation in the town. Encouraged by his friends Frederick and Octavia Fries from the local Religious Tract Society, he invited the local poor to summer parties at his residence at Fort House, serving plentiful amounts of food at his own expense. He taught geography and arithmetic at the local ragged school for working-class children and allowed some of the poorer boys to stay for several nights at Fort House, ensuring they were well-clothed and well-fed. In 1867, he converted a couple of the reception rooms into classrooms and opened a night school, teaching up to 500 boys over 5 years. He is said to have spent 90% of his salary for charitable purposes and also donated a gold medal he received from the Chinese emperor. Although Gordon's charitable work did not come under any scrutiny from his contemporaries, later historians and biographers in the 20th century theorized that while Gordon may have been a latent homosexual, there is no evidence that he acted upon those desires. In his biography of Gordon, the Canadian historian Brad Fort maintains that Gordon was heterosexual but chose to remain celibate at a young age out of a sense of Christian duty. While Gordon hoped he would be posted back to China, in 1871 he was appointed to the Danube Commission tasked with surveying the waterways of the Danube Delta. In October, he left for Galatsi, the port town he had last seen in 1857. While he found the work rather dull, he was glad to stay with Romolo Gessi in Bucharest and enjoyed his travels throughout the Romanian countryside. After promotion to colonel in February 1872, Gordon went to the Crimea in the summer to examine the condition of the British military cemeteries on the peninsula. And on his way back in September, he stopped off at Constantinople for dinner with the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. During the dinner, Gordon spoke with Nubar Pasha, the chief minister of Egypt, who was looking for someone to become Governor-General of Equatoria, or Southern Sudan, then under Egyptian control. The incumbent, another Englishman named Sir Samuel Baker, had been unsuccessful in carrying out his instructions to suppress the slave trade along the Nile. Nubar waited until Baker completed his term before making a formal offer in October 1873, which Gordon gladly accepted. After being made a general in the Ottoman army, Gordon departed for Africa on the 28th of January 1874, his 41st birthday. In February, he arrived in Egypt and reported to the Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha. Although nominally a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, since 1805 Egypt was effectively an independent state. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte had overthrown the Mamluk rulers of Egypt, but the following year, his fleet was destroyed by Lord Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. After British and Ottoman troops expelled the French in 1801, an Ottoman general of Albanian descent named Muhammad Ali became governor of Egypt in 1805. With the Ottoman Empire in decline, Muhammad Ali and his successors, who claimed the title of Khedive or Viceroy, enjoyed considerable autonomy and aimed to expand their territories. beyond Egypt, conquering Sudan in the 1820s. While the British were the primary beneficiaries of a close economic relationship with Egypt, the Khedives employed military officers and civil administrators from all over Europe, a practice encouraged by Ismail Pasha, Muhammad Ali's grandson, after becoming Khedive in 1863. In 1869, Ismail presided over the opening of the Suez Canal, a development of enormous economic benefit to Britain and Europe, reducing travel time to and from India by 2/3. Encouraged by the British, Ismail sought to expand into Central Africa, to the headwaters of the Nile and the Great Lakes, which would be one of Gordon's objectives as governor of Equatoria. During his meeting with the Khedive in Cairo, the new governor was offered his predecessor's salary of $10,000 a year,